It's my honor to introduce our panelists, just with very brief introductions. We're honored to have the Honorable Ruben Castillo, who is a former United States District Court judge in the United States District Court for the Northern District here. Ruben was the first person of Latino descent to be named a judge in this district and became the first Latino chief judge in 2013. He served on the bench here for roughly 25 years, and he is currently serving as chair of the Illinois Accountability Commission, which I'm sure he'll talk about, with the goal of creating a public record of conduct of federal agents during Operation Midway Blitz. Look forward to hearing from Ruben. Another honored participant is the Honorable Lori Lightfoot, who was the 56th mayor of the city of Chicago, the city's first Black woman, first LGBT person to hold that role. And prior to becoming mayor, she was a U.S. attorney in the criminal division, as well as a partner at Mayor Brown, and for a few years, chief administrator of the Police Department Office of Professional Standards. Lori's been very active in police oversight matters, and in her post-mayoral career, she is teaching and consulting on a variety of public interest matters. She recently organized and leads the Illinois Accountability Project, which she will describe, which is an effort to provide a clearinghouse for collecting evidence of abusive conduct by ICE agents. We're also honored to have Mary Meg McCarthy here. Mary Meg McCarthy is a longtime executive director of the National Immigrant Justice Center, which is a premier immigrant and human rights advocacy organization that oversees over 1,500 pro bono attorneys providing legal services to thousands of individuals annually. She's an expert on immigration law, policy, and practice, and has won many awards. She's testified before Congress. She's a frequent television guest, and her organization is the lead organization on a program that's providing legal assistance to immigrants in habeas corpuses here in the Northern District. We're also honored to have Matt Pierce. Matt is a nationally known litigator, senior counsel with the firm of Hughes, Sokol, Pierce, Resnick, and Dim. His focus includes complex litigation involving class actions, constitutional and civil rights, labor rights, employment, education, housing discrimination, law enforcement misconduct, immigrants' rights, RICO, to name just a few. He's also a member of the Whistleblower Advocates, and earlier in his career, he was a deputy corporation counsel for the city of Chicago. And he's a fellow of the American College of Trial Attorneys. And finally, we're pleased and honored to have as our moderator today, Sharon Fairley, who is now with the University of Chicago as a professor. Before joining that law school, Professor Fairley was a federal prosecutor initially, then first Deputy Inspector General and General Counsel for the City of Chicago, Office of Inspector General, and then Chief Administrator of the Independent Police Review Authority. And eventually she was responsible for creating and standing up the current police oversight body known as COPA, the Chicago Civilian Office of Police Accountability. And she is an accomplished teacher as well in the criminal realm. So with those things out of the way, let me turn it over to Sharon.
Well, thank you so much, David, for those introductions and for establishing the opportunity to have this conversation today. It's my pleasure to be at the table with each of you today. And I look forward to a lively discussion on this really important and very timely topic. What I thought I would do is just start myself by kind of framing the topic and talking a little bit about how we do hold police and law enforcement accountable in a general sense, because I think most of us are used to thinking about police accountability in the context of holding municipal police officers accountable, meaning like city or county, even to a certain extent, some state officers. And in that context, there are three legal mechanisms or processes by which a police officer can be held accountable. The first one, which is the most serious perhaps, is through criminal charges. And that's when an officer is charged with actually committing a crime. Usually it can be a state law crime, but there are also federal crimes that can be committed. And so you have a prosecutor making that decision. But it can be challenging to hold police officers accountable in the criminal context for a couple reasons. First, sometimes prosecutors are really loath to charge police officers because they're making cases with police officers all the time. And then the second thing is the beyond a reasonable doubt legal standard in the criminal context is really difficult sometimes, particularly where the evidence is just two competing narratives of what happened. So sometimes the criminal justice system isn't a great accountability mechanism. The second is the civil process, where you have someone who is the victim of police misconduct suing the officer or the officer's employer. And in the civil context, though, there's this doctrine called qualified immunity that prevents plaintiffs from being successful in a civil matter where the law wasn't clearly established that what the officer did was wrong at the time of the event. So that can be a real barrier to success and accountability in the civil context. And then the third legal mechanism is what's called the administrative process. And that's where the officer's employer takes administrative or disciplinary action against the officer, including things like suspending the officer up to the most serious thing of firing the officer or terminating the officer. And so the challenge of accountability in the administrative context comes from the fact that oftentimes it's the department or the superintendent of the police that's making the decision. And sometimes they are not happy about, punishing their officers. So sometimes the administrative process isn't going to be great. But on the other side, the one benefit about in the administrative process is it's police policies that govern the legal process. And sometimes police policies are actually more restrictive, certainly more restrictive than the constitutional standard for in terms of what police are expected to do. So sometimes the administrative process is going to be the best of the three options. Now, that is all said about how to hold municipal police officers accountable. Today here, we're talking about accountability related to federal law enforcement. The issues are way more complicated and the obstacles are much more serious in that context. And I think we are going to be learning a lot more about that based on our conversation today. So that's where we're starting with. What I'd like to do is ask each of our esteemed panelists just a broad question about the topic, which is, what are you and or your organization most concerned about when it comes to holding federal law enforcement, particularly in the immigration context, which is what we're here to talk about today? What is your biggest concern right now? What are you really focused on and thinking about? And
you want me to start?
Yeah, Judge Castillo,
Okay.
if you
The
don't mind.
easiest question first.
Okay.
Well, what I'm most concerned about is we don't have someone to really bring up accountability, and we don't have the type of laws that we need to get that accountability. And the governor appointed a commission, which I'm happy to chair, the Illinois Accountability Commission, which can document misconduct. The misconduct that we've seen since Operation Midway Blitz came to Chicago, and thank God has tailed off, is probably the easiest misconduct that I've ever seen to document. I mean, a lot of it is videotaped, a lot of it is photographed. There's witnesses galore. This is unusual. I mean, I was privileged to serve as a federal prosecutor with Sharon and Lori. We all have similar history. And, the usual norm is federal agents do not violate the law. In fact, federal agents help me prosecute police officers. That was the norm for misconduct, and using the first alternative that Ms. Farley described, which is criminal prosecution. So that was the norm that I was used to. I've never been in a situation where misconduct could be so open and notorious, could be so gleeful. That's one thing that's very unusual, that there's misconduct and officers doing it are laughing about it while they're doing it, or killing people and then being happy about it. I've never seen that in my entire life. It's just very, very open, notorious misconduct. And yet the U.S. Attorney's Office will look the other way because there's a Justice Department that is not doing what the name implies. There's no justice. And so you have an arm of the government, that the executive branch, that refuses to look at it because they feel like these ICE officers are doing appropriate duty and being aggressive. And if anything, I've seen the Attorney General say things that encourage that type of misconduct. And I've seen the Deputy Attorney General say he's seen nothing but professional behavior, which when you look at the videotapes, you wonder. And then you look at, well, maybe we can get local authorities to prosecute, and that is an uphill battle. In fact, one of the things that wasn't mentioned is one of the things I did as chair was make sure I got someone of the caliber of Matt Pierce to be our special counsel. And Matt and I are proud to individually, not as members of the commission, be part of an effort that is being made right now at 26 in California to have a special prosecutor appointed, because the current state's attorney makes it very clear that she doesn't intend to prosecute and investigate. We're not saying necessarily every agent has to be prosecuted, but certainly they should be investigated for potential prosecution. And yet there's no movement in that line. In September, someone was killed in Franklin Park. I looked at that videotape and I conclude that that was just a straight out killing. In October, a woman named Miss Martinez was shot 5 times and somehow managed to survive. She was prosecuted for a while by the very Justice Department that should be prosecuting the ICE agent who shot her. And instead she was prosecuted. That prosecution fell apart. And it's very clear to me, nothing but misconduct surrounded that shooting. So those are just 2 examples, but the state's attorney refuses to prosecute. So then we're left with your third alternative, administrative discipline. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Not under the former Homeland Security secretary who resigned in disgrace or was moved to some other position, threatening, the rest of the Americas, unfortunately. So she wasn't demoted. She wasn't disciplined. She was just like pushed. So I'll turn it over to the mayor.
Well, I mean, I think as not surprisingly, Judge Castillo really said what needed to be said and has laid the table. Well, the question was, what am I most concerned about? And I would say the total lack of accountability for officers, federal immigration agents who have rampaged through Chicago, Chicagoland, and various parts of Minnesota, the Twin Cities, Los Angeles, Maine, other locales, and particularly the Customs and Border Patrol agents who have no business ever being in an urban environment trying to do enforcement actions. And just to build on some of the points that Judge Castillo made, it's been almost 7 months since September 12th, 2025, when Silverio Villegas Gonzalez was murdered in Franklin Park. To date, we know of no law enforcement agency that is doing any investigation of his murder, which, like Judge Castillo, viewed every available videotape that was there. It was a botched traffic stop that we have seen in legions as these operations have increased, and a number of people out on the street in the uniforms of federal immigration agents has gone up exponentially. But for poor Mr. Gonzalez's 2 young children who are now orphans, there's got to be some justice for them. And what concerns me, not only for him, for Ms. Martinez, for the countless numbers of people who were injured doing peaceful protests at the Broadview facility, for the folks on Halloween in Evanston who were beaten unjustifiably by federal immigration agents. The list is long. There's got to be some accountability. And it is shameful, I mean, absolutely shameful, that our Cook County State's Attorney has taken the position it's not her job. Now, let me unpack that a little bit because I think it is worth talking about for a moment. Historically, in the general run-of-the-mill cases, the state's attorneys respond to investigations that are brought to them by local police. However, there's a legion of exceptions, which these matters should absolutely fall into. And the exceptions are in various categories. As Sharon and I both share the same history of being the leaders of the civilian accountability enforcement units. I was within the Chicago Police Department. It got moved out. Sharon took over. But what we know is that for years, going back to my time at least in the early 2000s, there is an agreement with, I'll call it OPS because that's what I ran, and that all of its successors with the state's attorney's office, if they believe that there's a matter of serious misconduct, a police-involved shooting, an allegation of excessive force, that the state's attorney's office takes over that case from OPS. And they necessarily do not work with the local police department because it's the activity and conduct of a police officer that's at issue. The state's attorney right now has 120 investigators, most of whom are former police officers or former sheriff's deputies. They don't just run around serving subpoenas on witnesses. They have the ability to do investigation. And truth be told, there has been, and it's had various names over the years, and it has a different name now, but there's a unit within the state's attorney's office whose sole function is to investigate serious allegations of misconduct and criminal activity on the part of local police officers. So, and I'll add one more piece. For years, many of us have had experience with the state's attorney's office. There was a unit called felony review. It still exists. Police officers can go to felony review, and felony review dictates the kind of evidence that must be gathered in order for them to consider bringing felony charges against someone. So, pardon me, I do not buy the excuse that it's not the state's attorney's role to prosecute allegations of misconduct on the part of federal agents. And again, I recognize that it is a high burden, but if you don't start, if you don't secure the evidence, and you don't open up a grand jury investigation, you are saying no and closing that door forever. Why it's so important, and I applaud the effort that's been made to get a special prosecutor opened up. There's no statute of limitations on murder. There's no statute of limitations on attempted murder. And there's generally a 5-year statute of limitations on excessive force, battery, and assault. So why are we wasting valuable time, letting evidence get spoiled or disappear entirely, and not doing what is necessary? We have innocent residents in Chicago and Chicagoland who have been abused physically and otherwise by federal immigration agents who, to my eyes, are untrained, unsupervised, and are wreaking havoc on First Amendment, Fourth Amendment rights of residents in our great city and the surrounding area. So what I'm most concerned about is a lack of responsibility, lack of accountability.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Pierce.
Let me be brief and take this kind of at a slightly more abstract level. If the question is kind of what keeps me up nights these days in the context of what we're talking about today, I think it's the fragility of the structures of government that I took for granted for my 50 years of mostly being a civil rights lawyer with a brief break to be the city's defense lawyer for a few years. I think I had a pretty hard realistic perception of them, but never in my worst nightmares did I think they could crumble so quickly and that they would be so vulnerable. That's, of course, in saying that, I'm extremely disappointed by lots of the people who are in the positions of those institutions of government. But I remember, in the first days of the national nightmare of the current federal administration, having, I don't know how many dinners with friends where they would say to me, it's going to be okay because I still have faith in the institutions of our government.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think about it and I would say, yeah, they work exactly as well as the people who you put in to run them. And what we are facing now is a wholesale takeover at every level of the federal government with people who are really fundamentally opposed to the democratic mission of that government. Not every aspect of the government, but the part of it that's supposed to protect the rights of those of us who just live here is crumbled. And then what keeps me up at night is the lack of ability, talent, wisdom, strategy on the part of the other political party that is not in power to effectively deal with the crisis that we're facing. In the context of the special prosecutor's petition, and thank you, Mayor Lightfoot, for your words, and thank you, Judge Castillo, for being one of the petitioners. Not a single countywide or statewide elected official, and they're all Democrats, right? I grew up in this county. I didn't know there were Republicans until I went away to college. Has come forward to openly support the petition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they quietly do, and we have a terrific attorney general who is on the vanguard of the litigation battles that are most important, I think, against the federal government. We have a mayor who openly and wholeheartedly believes in protection of constitutional rights and that Operation Midway Blitz was a plague upon the Chicago area. We have a governor who, I hope becomes the next president of the United States. We should be so lucky. I mean, he has been one of the best performing Democrats in the nation on the issues that I think test our moral and constitutional fiber, but not one of them supported the petition for the special prosecutor. Some local electeds did, mostly Latinos. And, back to the comments that Lori was making, this isn't a close call, right? Everybody saw the crimes on videotape, from at least homicide, criminal homicide in the case of Villegas, if not murder. What happened to Miramar Martinez, I mean, it's like a bad Elmore Leonard novel or something, I mean, for no reason, they shoot her up, they shoot up her vehicle, and then they frame her with the completely false charges of attacking federal agents, charges so flimsy that, they couldn't even get, with all the power of the Justice Department, they couldn't even keep the charges alive, let alone take them to trial. And I am proud of the work that the Accountability Commission is doing. I'm very pleased to hear about the work that Mayor Lightfoot is doing with her commission, but it's not enough. And the county state's attorney who is not prosecuting these cases is a Democrat. So it worries me too that in our two-party system, there don't seem to be two parties anymore effectively competing within that system. So I spend a lot of time worrying about how precarious our situation is right now.
Thank you, Matt. Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you. Well, thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to take this in another direction. As an immigration lawyer, where we provide legal services to the immigrants and refugees who are getting caught up in this outrageous situation and reality that we're facing, and cruelty and unlawfulness. Two things that we are witnessing right now is the most extreme iteration of immigration enforcement that we have ever seen, and the expansion of immigration detention. So let me talk about this extreme enforcement. And before I say that, both of these two areas, the seeds for this reality were planted years ago. And this administration has figured out how to maximize the cruelty on all fronts while pushing the limits of the legal guardrails. So enforcement. What we're seeing and what you've heard about a lot are these roving patrols. And what they're doing is they're arresting people without warrants. Well, we filed a lawsuit back in 2018, the Castellanova lawsuit, that said you cannot arrest someone without a warrant or probable cause. And what we were seeing was people being arrested without warrant or probable cause, hundreds of them. And because of this lawsuit, we were able to begin to hold the government accountable for these illegal arrests. But what they were going back to court to say was, well, we did come up with, a warrant, which they prepared while the person was handcuffed, or they had a supervisor review because they had supervisors on call. So we continue to fight these unlawful arrests. Let me talk about detention. We have seen the expansion, and many of you have heard about the warehouses that the government's buying. They have unlimited funds to do this, right? And they're buying warehouses to house hundreds. Currently, there are 100,000 immigrants in detention, and many of them are Illinois residents. And because Illinois passed a law saying we are not going to allow any county jails to detain immigrants in administrative custody, these individuals are being placed all over the country, from Indiana to Louisiana to Texas to California. So providing legal services is very challenging, but more importantly, detention conditions are terrible. And we have seen more than, I think, 15 deaths in immigration detention, which last year we saw about 30. So we've seen in less than a half a year more than we saw last year. So for NIJC, what's really important is that we challenge these unlawful arrests and detentions to be able to help people secure relief, immigration relief, to keep them with their families. So that's what's been concerning us as we see this expansion of enforcement and we see this expansion of immigration detention. How quickly can we get to people to help them and stop them from being deported and separated permanently from their family members?
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to pivot. I have a question for each of you individually. So we'll start with those. Judge Castillo, I'll start with you first. I mean, obviously, you are chairing the Illinois Accountability Commission, and we know, that it was established to create a public record of sorts of the misconduct that we're seeing here. How is that record taking shape? What are we learning from it? And how do we see it being used to help improve the situation? What can be done of it? What can we make of it to help stem the misconduct that's happening? If so,
Those are all really good questions. The record, I think, is relatively easy to make. We've had witnesses, both professional witnesses, witnesses who were victims. We have to be careful about that given their immigration status. We've taken testimony in all kinds of ways, sometimes more public, sometimes in sort of listening sessions where we hear from 30 people at one time. But the record is pretty easy, I think. I think the harder question is, what do you do with this record? Like, for example, one thing I want everybody to know who's listening here or via Zoom is we did put out an initial report in January of 2026, and that is on our website. There's going to be a final report coming out at the end of April, and I think our final report, Matt and I are trying to make it as comprehensive as possible. I think one thing that's important that the final report will set up is if Congress does change over, I think it's going to be very easy for a Democratic Congress to call on this record and then go forth with much more hearings. And I think some of those hearings have a lot of benefit. We saw the Homeland Security Secretary go through 2 hearings that were very difficult for her, and she didn't survive. You can imagine what other hearings would be if a Democrat was in charge and they weren't as twisted as some of the hearings. But even with these twisted hearings with the other party in charge, she did not survive those 2 hearings. Now, I will be the first one to admit, for other reasons. It wasn't because of the misconduct. It had to do with her advertising campaign or the way she slated it, the way she said the president had approved it, her personal misconduct. You know, there's a lot going on there, but I think those hearings are very beneficial. Mr. Bovino, who was in charge, did not survive. Once public scrutiny is on this type of misconduct, I think it's very helpful. As Martin Luther King used to say, you know, shed the light, and the light can overcome the darkness. And we've seen a lot of darkness. And I think if we had had more accountability by our state's attorney, this is what drives me crazy. If she had taken action when Mr. Villegas Gonzalez was killed back in September, if she had taken action when Ms. Martinez was shot in October, maybe, just maybe, those Minneapolis killings that we all saw on TV replayed over and over again, maybe they wouldn't have occurred. Maybe there would have been discipline of those agents, you know, but that never happened. It just never did. So we're hopeful that our work can create a record that will steer a debate. There is a debate going on right now about funding. Now, this agency has already gotten tremendous funding. You should all know that. They're going to double, triple their force. They're out there recruiting people. They have money for the next 10 years. But right now, for the first time, Democrats are trying to hold up. I know there's some kind of deal going on now, but I still think there's resistance to funding the kind of force that we see. So overall, I will tell you, I think what's important is the chronology too. The chronology of how this all occurred, because I've always focused on the fact that look at motivation, look at statements that are made when the president says he's coming to Chicago. He says there's going to be war in Chicago. And then he sends the type of military operation, people with masks, people fully armed as if they're invading a country. And there's, I think, a motivation to all of this that I think Ms. McCarthy talks about. You use all the discretion you can to detain people. You create horrible conditions on the street. You brutalize communities, and then you hope for, when you detain all these people, that of course they'll sign voluntary deportation. You know, it's just, that's what happens when a person is confronted with a system that seems so overwhelming. And then at the same time, the number of immigration judges has been cut dramatically so that any type of relief from the immigration courts is non-existent. In fact, agents were taking people who were trying to go through a legal system to try and get to the goal of becoming a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, taking a long road, a legal road, and being pulled right out of the courthouse to be detained. So I think there is a motive and a pattern. They know what they're trying to achieve. I mean, from the minute I saw people being deported to countries other than their origin, I thought to myself, there's, you know, what's the motivation?
It feels punitive, right?
Yeah, it's punitive.
It feels
It's punitive,
yeah.
and it's meant to scare.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of families, I will tell you, I'm sure Ms. McCarthy can talk about it, are just leaving on their own.
Right.
And it's like, why should we stay here? So there's been a lot of articles about that. And they're horrible conditions for detention. How can you come here with the idea of detaining 5,000 people and not have a place to put them? So you're putting them in overcrowded, you know, bad food, bad conditions, hoping that they'll sign a so-called voluntary deportation. and get right out of here and not knowing where they're going to go. It's just horrendous.
Thank you, Judge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mayor Lightfoot, you started your own initiative, right? The ICE Accountability Project. What do you hope to accomplish there? How's it going? What are you trying to do? I mean, I know Judge Castillo talked about shedding light,
Yes.
right? And that's really important. We both know that from being in oversight. Part of oversight is about shedding light on a problem so people know what's going on.
Well, so if you go to reporticenow.com, which is our URL, our goal is to create a centralized repository for the evidence that now exists out there. And by out there, I mean on individual phones, on social media accounts, and other places that is powerful testimony and memorialization of what's happened, but it's atomatized and it could easily disappear. If we see a difference, if there is a special prosecutor that's appointed, if our state's attorney wakes up and decides she's actually going to do her job, and I don't want to just focus on her, I want to say the sheriff also is important here, and I'm happy to explain why, but we need this evidence in a centralized place so that if prosecutions are going to happen, they have the evidence, and frankly, there's no second guessing it. If we have it and we've memorialized it, then there's even more impetus, I think, for local law enforcement to be able to do their job. There's a lot of overwrought rhetoric. Everybody's saying the right thing, but the actions, and this is, I think, one of the points that Matt was making, the actions, in my mind, speak louder than words. So reporticenow.com, the ICE Accountability Project, is really about making sure that we collect that information, that you can see it chronologically. As we get more incidents reported, our website can document what were the days of the week that these enforcement actions were happening, what was the time of day, what were the specific neighborhoods. So there's a lot of information that ultimately will be available once we kind of get to scale. It's been slow going. We need more people to upload incidents, but we've hired folks that are literally scouring what's available in public media and social media, various websites that have also been doing some documentation. It doesn't have to reside with us, although, of course, that's what we'd like. But we need a centralized place so there's no mistaking the evidence is there.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Pierce, I know you've spent time working on police accountability, in terms of the legal system. What are the biggest hurdles in holding federal officers accountable in the criminal and civil justice systems? I know Judge Castillo mentioned, some of the law that we have right now may not be helpful as much as we'd like. So is it a lack of the appropriate legal rules in place? Is it the lack of ability to prosecute, lack of ability to investigate, or is it all of these things? Can you tell us a little bit?
If you've applied for CLE, let me do a little really lawyering stuff so that
And then he'll give you the number.
it gets honestly earned. And those of you that aren't lawyers, I'll try and make it not too terribly boring. Look, there is a lack of an effective legal vehicle to address this because, the good news is that this is not a problem that we've experienced frequently over at least recent decades.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good thing that we haven't. But the system, as I say, the institutions are weak and the responses are really unsatisfactory. In the criminal prosecution arena, which we have all talked about a little bit, there's two choices of prosecutors, federal and state. I don't have to waste any time explaining why the Justice Department is not going to prosecute this misconduct. The head of the federal government is actively encouraging this misconduct. So it's just not going to happen. And at the local level, there is a legitimate legal barrier, or at least problem, may not be a barrier, to even local prosecution. And that is that there will be an assertion of a federal sovereign immunity defense if you tried to prosecute any of these federal officials who misbehaved, let's just say in Chicago in Operation Midway Blitz. But I have to tell you that, for the same reasons why, like, we've never been here before, there isn't a whole lot of clear legal answers to these problems. But based on the decided case law, I think there's a very strong chance that some of the misconduct here, even with the current extremely right-wing federal judiciary, could be seen as not barred by sovereign immunity. Why do I say that? Well, a sitting federal judge, has found that in repeated instances, ICE and CBP agents testified falsely under oath, knowingly falsely under oath, about the very misconduct that we're talking about. High-level ICE officials made obviously false statements, if you can believe the evidentiary record that was amassed in federal court, and by the way, which was not reversed on appeal, right? Those handful of cases that everybody was aware of, none of them ever got to a court that said, no, these things didn't happen. They did happen. They were videotaped. We know what happened. So there's a good chance with knowing falsification on the part of the federal agents that I think you could get around, in at least some criminal prosecutions, the assertion of a federal sovereign immunity defense. So that's the legal impediment that blocks state prosecutions. The other is a political impediment. And it's the political impediment is why I think it's frankly harder to get around at the moment here, much to my dismay, because the state's attorney speaks out of, I was going to say both sides of her mouth, but the story has shifted so many times, there's more than two. And she just doesn't want to do it. And I suspect she doesn't want to do it for, prosecutors, no offense to you former prosecutors, but in my view, they always like to shoot fish in a barrel. Okay. Prosecutors don't like to lose cases. It's not good for your career to lose cases. You got a lot of power on your side. So they tend to pick cases that, they're pretty confident is going to come out with a conviction. This case isn't like that. Okay. So in fairness, it's not shooting fish in a barrel. Criminally prosecuting federal agents for rampant misbehavior in a major urban area in Chicago, that's not a simple everyday case. But it also requires political courage, and I don't think our state's attorney has had that. Because I think that the legal arguments are strong and the facts are strong. And I think in the political calculus, some risk-benefit analysis has been done by her and her folks, and they've decided it's better to let this thing pass. But in any case, federal ain't going to happen, and we don't want it with the current prosecutor. State, we're fighting in court right now to get somebody put in there on a special prosecutor basis to actually investigate to prosecute. Stay tuned. That leaves civil claims, okay? And there aren't very good federal civil claims to effectively address something like this. There is a Federal Tort Claims Act, which is full of procedural impediments and minimal outcome opportunities that is rarely used. And I think it would be hard pressed to find lawyers to do it. There's no fee shifting. It's a contingent fee matter. It's a capped contingent fee. It's not a very attractive weapon. The regular civil rights claims that everybody's familiar with don't apply to federal actors absent conspiracies with local officials in very extraordinary cases. So 1983 that everybody's heard of can't bring a 1983 action against a federal agent. There are Bivens claims. There are common law claims for violation of the Constitution, which have been so restrictively interpreted by the federal courts in recent years that they are only limited to three constitutional provisions. And the First Amendment is not one of them. The Fourth, the Eighth, and the Fifth are the only ones I think that are left for Bivens actions. And the problem is worse than that. Courts have interpreted a very limited number of claims under those provisions that they believe can be brought under these so-called Bivens actions. And then there's qualified immunity, which is a judicially created doctrine that says that when government officials, state or federal, our legal claims are brought against them for violation of the law, unless the law is really clearly established by a prior case decision from a higher level court under closely analogous facts, they get the benefit of the doubt and they can't be found liable. So when you add all that up, it says there isn't much of a path to hold people responsible if, as we do, you have a local prosecutor who is unwilling. There is potential legislation that I think will be introduced in this session of the legislature. It has been introduced previously, that in the legal world, this is for your CLE credits. They're called converse civil rights actions. If you just write that down, then you should probably get your CLE credit. It's a legal jargon. And that's state law that allows for state law action to enforce federal constitutional violations. Those claims would likely be removed to federal court, even if the legislature passed them and they were brought in state court. But the law that would be applied by the federal judges, except for the sovereign immunity of defense, the immunity defense, the law that would be applied would be the law that interprets, applies a state statute, albeit a state statute that seeks to enforce the violation of federal constitutional rights. Happy to talk more about that if people have interest later on. I'm going to shut up, but I want to say that I think it is likely that we will see an iteration of converse civil rights laws being introduced in this legislature. So everybody listening and all of your organizations, get ready to lobby for it, because if there is a viable path, I think that's the best shot we got.
So I do want to get back, Mr. Pierce, to both two issues that you talked about, and that is the special prosecutor question, because I find it curious that we have this petition and she's already gone on record saying that she's going to oppose it.
Yep.
So it's not just that she won't do it herself, that she wants to oppose allowing somebody else to do it. So I'd love to talk about why we think that is. And then on the front of legislation, you mentioned, here in Illinois, we passed a statute, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on how helpful we think that that's gonna be. But first, I want to give Ms. McCarthy a chance. I know in the first question I asked you covered the next question, which was what's different about this moment, and we've heard you talk about the degree and extent of the kinds of enforcement that's going on now. One of the other things that I've noticed, though, is it's not only are the officers engaging in enforcement of the immigration regulatory scheme, right? That's there, but they're doing it in a way that is, to me, it seems like it's to squelch dissent about that, right? So they're doing it to squelch people who are expressing dissent about that or wanting to make sure that that's being done properly. Is that something that you've seen before?
If I understand your question, you mean non-immigrants who are struggling?
So for example, like I've read stories about individuals who, maybe they're out, they're in a car and they're honking their horn to warn people that ICE is in the area, and then those agents actually follow them to their house just so that they know. We know where you live.
Right.
That kind of enforcement, is that something that we've seen before?
Yes, we have seen that. We have, it's amazing the courage that people have demonstrated at this time to really speak out with knowing that we have rogue officers on the street who they don't care if you're a U.S. citizen, but they will take action that could be harmful. And yet people have really spoken out and been very clear that this is wrong and protecting their neighbors.
Sure.
We've never seen this level of indiscriminate immigration arrests.
Right.
We've never seen this level of mass detention, and we've never seen this level of due process violations.
Sure.
And people are outraged when they see what's happening.
Yes, may I
and they're
interrupt you
acting.
for 1 second? I just want to remind everyone who's viewing over Zoom, if you could please mute so that your background noise doesn't impede the ability of everyone else to hear. So please mute if you're watching over Zoom. I'm sorry, Ms. McCarthy, please continue.
No, I think people are just outraged, and
Yes.
that outrage has overcome their fear. and their inability to act despite this type of enforcement action that we're seeing that impacts all of us. But people are thinking twice. Like I know people who have a loved one who's in the immigration process. They're not going to go to the march. They are protecting their family member right now. So I think it is a difficult reality, but the numbers really speak for themselves. I mean, most of those arrests under Midway Blitz were unlawful arrests, whether we talk about it under the immigration statute or the NAVA consent decree, which I mentioned earlier. And what happened is many of those people have disappeared. As Judge Castillo said, they were pushed into taking voluntary departure, or they just accepted deportation without ever seeing an immigration judge or receiving any type of consultation from a lawyer.
Wow.
The government in its filings in the Nava case indicated that there were possibly over 1,000 individuals who were arrested without a warrant.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we saw, I think, let me just confirm, there were about 60% of those, 1,100 of those individuals had already been deported. So they never had a chance to exercise their rights.
Mayor Lightfoot, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in a little bit on this. In 2019, that summer in particular, Trump was the president then, and there was a lot of immigration activity going on at that point. But I think what's different in this moment is a couple things on both sides of the ledger. The level of callous brutality is just something that we have not experienced, and certainly not by taxpayer-funded employees. When after the murder of George Floyd and crime really spiked here in Chicago and across the country, one of the things that I think really animated a lot of fear about crime, particularly in neighborhoods that weren't accustomed to a level of violence, was carjackings.
Yes.
So just driving in your car, going about your day, and then some idiot comes up and sticks a gun in your face and demands your vehicle. It's the same thing with what we're seeing with these agents coming out of nowhere, smashing windows, cutting seatbelts, and pulling people literally out of their cars. It's the same level of personal violation, but it's being done by people we pay to do law enforcement. I just think it is next level like we have actually not seen or experienced before. And I think one anecdote that I heard someone say, well, two I'll give, is people who are putting air tags somewhere on their person every time they leave their house so that a loved one will know where they are if they get picked up. That just took my breath away when I heard that. And the other thing is, I think it was Minnesota Senator Tina Smith who said, the challenge that they are facing, this really goes to Mary Meg's point, is that by the time somebody gets arrested and the family is trying to figure out where in the heck they are, they're already in Louisiana or Texas and on their way out of the country before anything can happen. Like the level of brutal efficiency of this new regime to whisk people up in one area of the country and then have them on their way out the door within hours before anyone can figure out that maybe that they're even missing is astonishing and horrifying.
Yeah. It's so true. Go ahead.
I do want to say this also affects U.S. citizens. I mean, before the commission, a number of U.S. citizens have testified they've been detained unnecessarily. You know, they have admitted themselves, ICE detaining U.S. citizens. They say there was obstruction going on, but then they never charge individuals with obstruction. They take them in under the pretense of you've obstructed. They detain them for hours, and then they conveniently release them. That's basically a pattern we have seen over and over again. And I think, you know, Mayor Lightfoot hit something that definitely has resonated with me. Customs Border Patrol is just a rogue organization. They have been killing people along the Mexican border for ages. Literally, that was established by various witnesses who testified before our commission. And they've done it with impunity because they could get away with that. No one in this videotaping them. And they're all Mexican nationals who they just pull out their revolvers pretty much willy-nilly with no discipline. And they, in fact, they even created a unit to cover up some of their misconduct. And this is all documented going back to other administrations. Under Obama, this is Clinton, 20 years. Now the only change has been, this is the first time that Customs Border Patrol, these wild cowboys, have come up to northern cities, Democratic cities, and have been released to do whatever and encouraged to use violence and then allowed to be masked without their identities being clear. So all of that encourages an atmosphere of you can do whatever you want because they're told sometimes by their supervisors, you have immunity. The president has immunity. Everybody has immunity. So go out and do as you see fit and be aggressive. And so that creates a culture that pulls out guns pretty easily and fires them pretty easily, as we've seen.
And of course, that's going to be exacerbated by the state's attorney saying she's not going to prosecute these cases because they realize that they do have impunity. So just getting back to that for a second, given that, everything that you've described, clearly there's a public safety issue here in Cook County, in the city of Chicago, that this enforcement activity has created and is exacerbating at this point. So you would think that the people responsible for maintaining public safety, which would include the state's attorney, right, would be concerned about that and want to take action. So do we think, and again, when you think about, on the one hand, you can say, this federal administration is extremely vindictive. So you could see, how as a prosecutor, like maybe I don't want to take them on because then they're going to attack me. They're going to start, looking at my mortgage records. And do you know what I'm saying? So,
but you still got to do your job.
Right. So
you're elected to do a job.
Okay. So
you cannot stick your head in the sand
right.
in your jurisdiction. And if I can add, since I've inserted myself,
go ahead.
The other thing that I think people need to focus on is, let's take Franklin Park. Franklin Park has a police force of 46 sworn officers. By the website, it does not look like they have any actual investigative resources. So they don't have detectives who can go out to a scene and collect evidence. Typically, in small municipalities, Broadview has 20-something officers, right? So when these things happen outside of the confines of the city of Chicago, in Cook County, these municipalities rely upon the sheriff or rely upon a multi-jurisdictional task force of some sort to be able to do the job that they actually don't have the resources, expertise, or bandwidth to be able to do themselves. So I said earlier, I don't want the sheriff off the hook either. Like, where's Tom Dart? Why haven't we heard from him either? And candidly, where's the state police? They could get in on this action easily. So there's a lot of overblown rhetoric from folks, but where the rubber meets the road is crimes have been committed. It's well documented. There's no dispute, although obviously entitled to a presumption of innocence. But the fact that you won't even investigate, right? Yeah, high hurdle to demonstrate that an agent was acting outside the scope of his authority at the particular moment that something happened. No question, but we know how to do that. Right. And importantly, the state's attorney knows how to do that and make those distinctions. But the refusal to just gather evidence when these little municipalities have no capacity to do this on their own and to then say, well, I haven't been presented with a case. Well, okay, but you control the grand jury. You could be the convener. You could set up a multi-jurisdictional task force of law enforcement to collect and gather this information.
And if you don't want to do it yourself,
Then don't oppose, right.
allow a
Right.
special prosecutor to be appointed to actually to take on the work.
But the lack of capacity and bandwidth, and it's not a criticism, it's just a reality of these little communities
Sure.
is really something that we also ought to be talking about.
So we've got about 10 minutes left before I want to open to the audience for questions. So what I'd like to do now is try to, get towards something a little bit more upbeat. What are the potential solutions here? Are there any potential solutions here that we can try looking at, or what are you hopeful about? What do you think are things that we should be thinking about? And how can, the audience that's listening out there, how, if at all, can they, participate in those solutions or contribute to them?
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that because
Yay.
one area that we have really expanded is habeas petitions. Because the quicker we find out from a community member that someone was arrested and detained, or from the family member, and Fred Sau's not here from Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, but they have a whole family support network, a hotline that then they refer cases to NIJC. And the quicker we file a habeas petition while that person is still here in Illinois, the more likely we're going to be able to get that person released on a habeas. And so the judges play a really important role, federal judges. And I have to say, some of our judges have been really great in terms of responding quickly and taking some personal risks. When you talk about people who are taking risks, I mean, they have fulfilled their jobs and duties as federal court judges. And I think that's really, really hopeful. The other area I wanted to highlight is, I mentioned this earlier, is communities. I mean, that really gives me hope to see how we have just expanded awareness about how broken, how fragile the system is, where there's just indiscriminate enforcement, a lack of denying people due process, which gives me hope for what could be possible in the future for reform. And then the third area I wanted to highlight that gives me hope is on Friday, last week, there was a unanimous vote in the Senate that passed funding for TSA agents and some of the DHS officers, but they did not support funding for ICE and CBP. As I said earlier, they have nearly limitless resources under that reconciliation bill. And I think that, along with what they have seen in terms of this horrendous treatment, the cruelty and unlawfulness by this rogue group of officers, I wouldn't even call them doing enforcement, because enforcement, you assume they have some legality, but just this arrest and detention and mass deportations, I think was a sign that Congress is seeing what's happening.
Thank you.
Can I say
Yeah, go
one
ahead, yeah,
thing?
please, yeah.
I have to take issue with your use of the word rogue. I don't think it's rogue at all. I think they're directed by their superiors, who in turn are encouraged by the President of the United States. That's not rogue. That's something much worse than rogue. And so, you want me to get optimistic? People of the city of Chicago made me proud to be a lifelong Chicagoan. We still have elections in this country. Hopefully people will exercise their rights to vote in intelligent ways. But the next few years are going to be very painful.
I think that we can look to what's happening in other parts of the country.
Okay.
The Hennepin County prosecutor has, I think, been nothing short of courageous and saying, not on my watch, not in my county, not in this moment. She, I think, recognizes it's going to be an uphill battle. We look just north of us, Lake County. The Lake County prosecutors similarly said, anything that happens in this county on my watch, I'm going to investigate. And if the facts and the law are aligned, I'm going to prosecute. Same thing with the Philadelphia district attorney. So the examples, I wouldn't even call it courage. I just think people saying, I was sworn and elected to do a job that includes investigating homicides and attempted murders in my jurisdiction. And I'm going to pay attention to that. And I am also going to pay attention to places where I see excessive force, indiscriminate use of chemical agents and tear gas. We have the examples all around us. And, candidly, if somebody doesn't want to do their job, then let's help them out the door. That's, I think, another thing that ultimately is important. I'm a little surprised at what we've seen, the lack of interest in actually righting obvious wrongs. But now as a friend of mine said, the truth, knowledge is power. Now we know. So I think we need to basically conduct ourselves accordingly. But I will echo what Matt has said. The thing that's been amazing to me, and I think we really have set the standard for the nation, is the way that people all over this city, and frankly, in a lot of neighborhoods you wouldn't necessarily expect, have rallied. They've organized themselves in alert teams, blowing whistles, honking car horns, organizing groups to walk kids to and from school, organizing meals for people that don't feel safe, or groceries. I mean, the things we have done as a community in response to this horrible plague that was amongst us for months, we ought to be proud to be Chicagoans. There's a lot of reasons why we should, but that looking out for our neighbors in neighborhoods all over the city and Chicagoland makes me very, very proud.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have some, political leaders who are stepping up to the plate. So we know Governor Pritzker signed HB 1312 into law in December of 2025. Was that an important accomplishment? Is that something that we can look to as providing some hope here, as providing, improving the legal landscape, if you will, to accountability?
I can't imagine it will withstand federal scrutiny. I think it'll be stricken quickly.
Oh, okay.
We're worried about it.
You're worried, okay.
Yeah, that's why I think we need new legislation that Mr. Pierce described, and we're going to fully support that effort, because I think that particular legislation kind of created an exemption and was really focused just on the federal government. So a conservative court could say that discriminates against the feds. So if you're going to have legislation to hold someone accountable and allow civil rights attorneys to bring lawsuits against misconduct, it needs to be even-handed.
Right. So, but there is the potential to do something that would have a greater likelihood of withstanding constitutional scrutiny. Yes.
And that's what I think Matt and I will both be supporting.
And for both the CLE applicants and the non-lawyers, let me add sort of this 25 cents worth of lawyering. The reason why that bill that was signed into law in December, I think, dies a quick constitutional death.
And maybe describe just what it is.
Yeah, it's a bill that provides for enhanced protections against ICE and CBP activities in sort of sensitive locations, schools, hospitals and clinics, houses of worship. It's obviously tailored to the misconduct we've just seen. It addresses critically important issues, but from a legal analytical viewpoint, the fact that it is a state law targeting federal actors makes it what is called unconstitutional federal discrimination under the Supremacy Clause. And basically, to translate that into really simple terms, it's not a very complicated concept. States can't pass laws that specifically focus on how the federal government should behave. But at least under existing state case law around the country, states can pass laws requiring all government actors at every level to obey the Constitution, because we all got to obey the Constitution. That's the law of the land. We all know that much law. However, that gets interpreted still. That's the biggest law that sits over all the other laws in the entire country. And a statute that says all you government officials, whether you're a beat cop in Broadview or whether you are a commander in ICE or in the state police or whatever, all government officials will be held liable if they are found to violate the Constitution, or perhaps you could cherry pick your favorite Bill of Rights clauses and tack them on and limit the application of the law. Under existing case law, that should, I say should, because I know who sits on the Supreme Court of the United States, it should pass scrutiny. It should not be found violative of the Supremacy Clause because of its general applicability. It therefore does not discriminate, as the language is used, against federal conduct. What we got now doesn't have that. The governor has tried for that in the past, but political moments make for the opportunity to pass new laws. I think we are still in such a political moment. I have no doubt the governor's sophisticated legal team understands this distinction. I have reason to believe there will be a bill introduced, and I hope all the advocacy organizations, I hope, NIJC and ICER and everybody else focuses on getting this passed, because the immigration system has very few safeguards. The federal courts are an increasingly hostile place to vindicate constitutional rights and an unavailable place for a variety of reasons. These claims would probably go to federal court, but the state law that we would craft would be a valuable effort, at least, to provide people with a way to fight back other than the very commendable community watches and the bike riders with whistles and made me cry. I mean, I was never so proud. I'm a lifer. I love the city. I have loved it all my life. I've never loved it more than I do now. It is really moving. And, Minneapolis got a lot of focus and a lot of attention for good reasons as well as not so good reasons. But I think the groundwork for the pushback happened here.
No question.
Happened here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Pierce. I think now's a good time to open the floor to questions from the audience that's on Zoom. So if you do have a question, you may unmute yourself and ask it. We should be able to hear you if there are any questions. Yes.
If one of the goals of the accountability or the transparency that you're looking at is to deter or curb future conduct, right now there's a recurring bad conduct going on, and that is that large vehicles with no license plates, with blacked out windows, with aggressive drivers who are federal agents are leaving the Broadview facility and terrorizing the roads in the Chicagoland area. And I just found out recently that the Secretary of State actually has a police force in addition to the agencies that you all mentioned.
Secretary of State.
Yes.
Their Secretary of State.
Yes.
Yeah, our
Probably both have police.
Illinois Secretary of State.
Illinois,
Illinois Secretary
yeah.
of State, if I didn't say that,
Lexi Gino.
has a police force. My question is, why not get the police agencies that have jurisdiction over the federal agents that are drivers that are terrorizing the roads, that are likely the ones that have committed and continue to commit the crimes that you've talked about, and tow those vehicles and arrest those individuals?
So I think the Secretary of State has taken some action, because another thing that the agents are doing, which you did not mention, is they were taking license plates and moving them to different vehicles. So it was difficult to match up the plate with the make and model of the vehicle. And I believe that the Secretary of State took some action and notified them that's illegal and we're going to do something about it. Look, fundamentally, there needs to be much more coordination at the state and at the county level to come up with a range of solutions and decide who's going to be running point on these things. We haven't, unfortunately, seen that yet. I think the opportunity is there. My fears are coming back this summer. I don't think they've gone away. I know we at the ICE Accountability Project are assuming and preparing that there will be another wave that comes back. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm probably right. But there needs to be that level of coordination with folks who have the resources and the jurisdiction to be able to do so. It's not rocket science, but, Matt said it right. Fundamentally, it's got to be about the political will to do that. But that, to me, is the really low hanging fruit. It's not, I'm going to prosecute somebody who shot someone or rammed a car, a little more politically fraught to be sure. But when people are violating local vehicle laws, that's easy. Just take care of it.
Sure, absolutely. Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, yes. Yes.
Under the category of what keeps one up at night, at least for me, is the chatter that's come from several parts of the current administration, including the worst end of it, Steve Bannon, that ICE agents are going to show up in the midterm elections and actually in the polling places, which seems to me to be, obviously from a political strategy, a naked intimidation strategy to suppress a vote that is anticipated to be against the administration. Is there any preemptive, proactive legal strategy to stop that under the Constitution or under state law or in state court? Or are they so immune that they can just show up and do whatever they want in what's probably ought to be considered the temple of democracy, our very local polling places? And if nothing else, are you going to do anything to record this proactively?
I'm happy to jump in there. Look, I think, the legal mechanisms to file lawsuits against this administration on a number of different fronts is already there. And I think should that actually manifest itself, I think people will file the appropriate suit. Somebody like the ACLU or others that have been gathered. But I think as a practical matter, I'm not sure that's actually going to happen, because if you do the math and look at the number of agents that exist in all of the federal immigration infrastructure, there's not nearly enough to cover, even if you just focus on blue states.
Right.
There's just not enough of them. Part of the reason why they're so frustrated by sanctuary city laws is because they need the local police to expand the size of their workforce. We're talking about all in now, if you talk about CBP, ICE, HSI, which is a unit within DHS, I'm going to venture a guess it's under 10,000. There's probably 10,000 polling places just in Illinois. So good luck trying to actually carry that out. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned, but I think as a practical matter, they don't have enough bodies to pull that off and continue to do the baseline of border protection. They surged 3,000 agents to Minneapolis, and obviously we know what the disaster results were of that. If they could have surged more, they would have. They don't have enough bodies, and they're not going to get they're not going to get tens of thousands online, even though they have an outrageous amount of money through what I call the big ugly bill that was passed last summer. They just don't have enough bodies to be able to pull it off. But I'm confident that if it were to happen, somebody would go and properly file a lawsuit, because it would, we've got a lot of precedent around electioneering. You can't interfere with local elections, period, full stop.
We had a professor who testified that could be the objective here. And, his deployment of ICE agents to airports, it could be the prelude to doing that during the midterms. So it could happen, and it wouldn't take coverage on every single polling place, because realize the word gets out on the street that ICE is around polling places. That's enough for people not to go out. That's enough, because as it is, we've had a lot of testimony before the commission that people are staying home. People are pulling their kids from school. People are not showing up for medical appointments that are very necessary. So it didn't take much for all of a sudden people in the immigrant community become very isolated and having groceries delivered, their kids taken to school by US citizens. So it could very much be part of the equation here.
But all
We're
the more,
concerned.
all the
Yeah.
more reason why people should early vote. And
Which is what he would want to take away too.
Yes.
Like Trump did.
Yes, like Trump did.
We have just enough time for a very quick lightning round final comment from each of you. So I'm going to start at the end there with Ms. McCarthy. Very quick.
I mean, I'm hopeful that, these communities that have really come together and spoken out, not only in Chicago, Minneapolis, but we're seeing it in smaller communities and rural areas, that there's a real shift, that we have to defend our democracy. And it begins right now with immigrant rights, because it's a slippery slope from there.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce.
I have been saying for years that immigration is the civil rights issue of our era. I think that has unfortunately become very apparent to people all over the country in the cruelest possible manner. I think it is important that people build on that in terms of righting what is a terribly, terribly broken system, and that people have the patience to continue their efforts of opposition, because this is not going to end quickly. I mean, even if the midterms are stunningly, overwhelmingly great for the Democratic Party, we will have a divided government and a divided country, and a country to which a huge amount of damage has been done to the rule of law. And, even if we swept everything in the fall, and we don't have everything to sweep in the fall, the rebuilding process of what has been destroyed already is profound. So I think people need to set their minds to the fact that this ain't going away quickly, and it has to be taken very seriously every day for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Mayor Lightfoot.
Briefly, reporticenow.com. That's our URL. I hope people will go to the website. I want to thank the Chicago Council of Lawyers for convening this very important conversation today. I've written down a lot of notes from things that I've heard from my fellow panelists, but importantly, I think we have to get off the sidelines and get involved. If you don't want to be out there in the streets, which I understand, write a check. If you can't write a check, join an organization that could use your volunteer support, your time, your treasure, your resources. There's lots of different ways to get involved, and no more important moment than now. And I think Matt's right. And I say this, people ask me, well, why do you care about this issue? You're a US citizen, you're Black, because if one of us is at risk, we are all at risk. And our democracy is on the precipice. We're about to celebrate 250 years, and we got a lot to repair in our very broken systems.
Thank you, Mayor.
I agree with all the comments.
Yeah.
We all have our role to play, to fight what is sheer brutality that has come into the streets of Chicago, hopefully will not reappear. But there is hope out there, and we just need to continue to fight it all the way through to the end.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. For those of you who are out there joining by Zoom, thanks for spending your afternoon with us. We're grateful to have your presence. Again, thank you to the Council of Lawyers for putting this together, and thank you to the esteemed panelists for their insight and commentary, which has been really helpful. And we hope you all have a lovely evening. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
You're right there now.